So I am interested in the philosophical side of things. So one of the things that I see in the Xenobots and some of the other kind of exotic robots that we work with is a conflation of thought and action. So if you take a Roomba, the robot vacuum cleaner, you can point to the wheels and you can say action. You can open it up and point to the CPU and say, thought or cognition or processing. Traditional robots, there is a Cartesian cut you can make that separates the body from the brain. But what I'm excited about is if you look at a lot of cutting edge technologies, that separation is becoming less and less obvious, which I think is, finally the beginnings of an acid that's dissolving this distinction that, at least in the West, has been around for over 300 years. So I think that's great from a purely intellectual point of view. But again, it also is important for us as a species to understand that, brains are not everything and everything else is expendable. The story is much more complicated than that. And I think that finally overturning Cartesian dualism will actually be a positive thing for society.
Josh, I've been following your work for years, and you guys have done some incredible stuff in the field. It's biology, robotics, artificial intelligence, so many different branches we can go into. But I think the best place to start would be, let's start with definitions. How do you define life, consciousness, and intelligence?
Life, consciousness, and intelligence. So we're diving in the deep end to start. Okay. So to me, I am very much in favor, not surprisingly, of an embodied approach to life. So life, in many ways, is a process of self-construction. This has been articulated, I think, best in the idea of autopoiesis, that you can construct your own components. Those may be parts of your own body, parts of your own brain, tools, they may be offspring. It's almost a cliche, but life perpetuates itself, which seems obvious and almost tautological. But it is not a trivial thing to perpetuate oneself and constantly self-construct. And so that is, to me, the definition of life. None of our technologies, no inert materials that we know of are capable of this. And that's part of what interests me about robotics. I believe in future we will create machines that are living in the sense that maybe they're made of living materials, but even if they're not, that they're able to constantly construct the self and propagate the self in various ways into the future. So that's my definition of life. You asked about consciousness. All cards on the table. I'm an illusionist. I do not believe consciousness is a thing. We've been looking for it for a long time, haven't found it. I think it's just one of those things that's the most convenient term that humans have come up with for something that's epiphenomenal, that's not really there. I would follow in the footsteps of Daniel Dennett in this way, that it is a form of illusion, and we can point to optical illusions, auditory illusions, motor illusions. Our brains are very good at fooling themselves, and I think fooling themselves into believing they are conscious is one of those things. And what was your third desideratum?
Intelligence.
Intelligence. Aha. Yes. Okay. That one, again, I'm sort of a very pragmatist about. Intelligence is the ability to make sure that you do not get painted into a corner in the future. That's it.
I love the fact that you brought up the fact that you think consciousness is an illusion. Well, I guess the word there is quite important and difficult to work around because you often have to backtrack what that means. When I wrote my dissertation, it was on illusionism as a theory of consciousness.
Okay, there you go.
Followed in the footsteps of Dan Dennett, Keith Frankish, Michael Graziano, and I put all of this together to defend it within psychiatry. And I find it interesting because it's a very misunderstood theory of consciousness. Well, it's not really a theory of consciousness, but rather a theory that shows how other theories of consciousness tend to lack substantive evidence of what they're talking about. So it's almost like intuition pumps, what Dan Dennett called four theories of consciousness, sort of how to think of it. But when I look at your work, it's almost easy to say that you might be an illusionist. And I thought that right up until now. So you've managed to confirm what I'd been thinking all along.
Okay, great.
Let's start off with I've scheduled this. I've prepped this podcast with 10 main questions in mind. The first one
Sure.
is what you just mentioned, embodied intelligence. In the book you co-authored, How the Body Shapes the Way We Think, you argue that cognition is deeply rooted within the body's physical form. So how does this embodied perspective challenge our traditional abstract models of mind? I mean, this podcast is called Mind Body Solution, paying homage to the infamous mind body problem, but therein might be a problem. The fact that we're differentiating between mind and body, separating these two entities. Does this problem exist? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, okay, great. Embodied cognition, this term, it means a lot of different things to a lot of people. I've worked in embodied cognition for many years now. So my particular perspective in it is exactly that there is no distinction between what we conveniently refer to as mind and what we maybe less problematically refer to as the body. There is no separation. There are some additional kind of add-ons, evolutionarily recent add-ons like neurons and brains and central nervous systems and prefrontal cortices, but they're the icing on the cake. They're not the cake. The nervous system facilitates things that organisms without brains were able to do for a very, very long time, that when you get down to brass tacks, there isn't anything really qualitatively new that brains have brought to the table. Although from a human perspective, it often feels like there is. Again, illusions are creeping back in.
When you think of embodied cognition, how familiar or how much do you also consider what psychologists call the 4 ECogSci? I mean, inactivism, embodied cognition, and then you have the others like embedded cognition, and is the other E? And there's one more.
I'm trying to remember now what it is.
It's embedded. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think this my belief comports with a lot of those. And now putting on my roboticist hat, the devil is in the details. What exactly does it mean to be, all the E's, empowered, enacted, enabled, you name it, embodied? That it's at the surface, it's kind of intuitive, something or someone that has a body that's a physical tool with which to interact with the environment, somehow, intuitively has more options and ability to prevent getting painted into a corner in the future, right? Just kind of makes sense. But what I find fascinating in the research that I do and some of my colleagues do is when you get down into the weeds, things become very non-obvious. So I co-authored How the Body Shapes the Way We Think with my PhD advisor, Rolf Pfeiffer. And when I was a PhD student with Rolf, I would always ask him, how exactly does the body shape the way we think? What exactly is it about the body that neural networks can't do? And we would have, a lot of heated discussions about that. And that's what I've dedicated my career to, is to trying to quantify and concretize exactly what this means, because we can build machines to try out some of these theories. Whereas in the cognitive sciences and the psychological sciences, there's only so much we can do to humans to try and understand how E's exist in humans. But with robots, you can do anything. So I think that's the difference between the fields. But I think their long-term goal is the same, is to really understand what all these E's mean.
Mm. You actually touched on the one. I think I might have made a mistake, but the other E was extended.
Extended.
Yes, those tools that we do use. Yeah. So like our cell phones, everything else that we use that form part of our cognition. That
absolutely.
In terms of evolutionary design of intelligence, your work in evolutionary robotics explores how machines evolve adaptive behaviors. And can you explain how these evolutionary algorithms guide this process, and whether such evolved systems could ever cross into the realm of, let's say, consciousness or sentience?
Sure. So, so for those of your listeners that aren't familiar with the field of evolutionary robotics, the approach is more or less what the name implies, which is that we try and we create AI that evolves bodies and brains of robots in simulation. So I'm sitting here in my office, and on the far side of the quad, I can see the building where our supercomputer is housed. And inside that supercomputer, in the GPUs, there's 10,000 virtual worlds running right now. And inside each of those virtual worlds, there's a swarm of virtual robots. And every once in a while, some of those robots disappear because the AI is deleting the ones that aren't doing such a good job at whatever we want them to do. And the AI makes randomly modified copies of the surviving virtual robots. So that's the methodological approach. This AI that I mentioned, it's arguably the oldest form of AI. It's called an evolutionary algorithm. And you can trace it back almost to the 1940s. Some argue that the very first computer program that was ever written was something that looked kind of like an evolutionary algorithm. And it's kind of, an intuitive idea. If you don't know how to solve your problem, why don't you just create a population of random solutions, measure how good those solutions are, delete the bad ones, make randomly modified copies of the survivors, and off you go. I think the second part of your question was, well, how might this process lead to, more abstract forms of cognition like sentience and consciousness? It's a very good question. I've been working in evolutionary robotics for over 20 years now, and we tend to focus on, sensor motor tasks, behaviors rooted in sensory motor things. So locomotion, object manipulation, swarm behavior, collective intelligence, that sort of thing. But we have dabbled in the more abstract, aspects of cognition. In some work I did in my postdoc with Hod Lipson at Cornell, we evolved a robot that evolves understandings of itself. So it gets a little like in the movie Inception. So you have a virtual robot, and it's trying to survive, and that virtual robot is running simulations of itself in its own virtual head, and it is using those guesses about itself and its current situation to guide its behavior. So there's an old theory, in the biological and cognitive sciences that self-awareness, I don't know about consciousness, but self-awareness evolved for very good evolutionary reasons. If you are near the edge of a cliff, and you are able to simulate what would happen to yourself, if you can mentally rehearse what would happen if you take 3 more steps forward, obviously you're in a much better evolutionary situation than someone who cannot mentally rehearse and has to physically take those 3 steps to see what happens. So we have seen evidence in some of our simulations where our robots start to evolve what we call self models, a model of self, and they use it to avoid risky behaviors, practice things before trying them in reality. And you can see that how for many people, that's a stepping stone towards very abstract things like consciousness.
And I think it reminds me of some work done. Well, Reshaping talks about something similar in his work. But Nicholas Humphrey, he wrote a book called Soul Dust, and he talks about one of the functions of consciousness also having this self-awareness, or this awareness of being alive in itself, the beauty of being conscious and surviving in this world, which can be another force and driving force with keeping us alive. So if the AI eventually discovers that the fact that it's there in the first place is important in itself, because it now has this ability to experience, it therefore will not take that further step if it does process those thoughts of, if I take a few more steps, I'm going to fall off the cliff. Is that something that you've seen presenting itself in any form or any way? Sorry, I'm sidetracking now.
No, that's okay. I haven't, but that's something that we certainly are on the lookout. So if you are able to simulate self, if you have some sort of abstraction that you can form of self, obviously it's also useful for social creatures. So if I can form a model of self, I can adapt that to form a model of other. And a good model of other, like you, is the assumption that you're also running a simulation of yourself in your head, which probably includes a simulation of me, which includes a simulation of you. And so, this these evolutionary pressures towards self-awareness very quickly can lead to recursion and reflexivity, which is the awareness of being aware. And for many people, that is a definition of consciousness.
Exactly.
So
that sort of metacognition, which most people talk about, is their own definition of what consciousness is.
there you go.
So
Now, it doesn't quite handle qualia very well, but it, you know, captures a lot of what people think of when they think of consciousness.
I think to a lot of philosophers and psychologists, just knowing that some artificial intelligences have this ability to self-reflect and develop these self-models is probably enough for them to think that this is conscious.
Again, as an illusionist, I'd say sure, absolutely. You know, using the term consciousness to describe this, you know, this recursive self-awareness seems useful, as it is also useful for describing our ability to be recursively self-aware.
Let's expand on that a bit. I mean, an illusionist, when they think about consciousness, I mean, we know that the brain plays tricks on us all the time. Whether it's optical illusions, auditory, it doesn't really matter. Hallucinations and experiences occur all the time. Just like AI confabulates, we confabulate. We make up stories. When something happens, we remember it incorrectly, and we create and draft new stories to explain this phenomenon. Are these all the varying reasons that you've come to this conclusion that we fundamentally are flawed species? We're limited by biological processes, heuristic adaptations. And therefore, we can't assume when we ask what is consciousness in an AI that we even are conscious in the first place. It's like we know.
Well, again, I'm perfectly fine with that non-problematic side of it, which again, for most people, captures part of what they mean by consciousness. As an illusionist, what I have a problem with is that taking the further step to things like qualia and the redness of red, and you know that there are these things called qualia and they're in there somewhere. To me, that's a step too far. You know, it feels as if we have them, and I think it's an epiphenomenal, you know, part of something to do with self-awareness. So that's that part of it I don't buy.
When you guys work, there's 4 of you when it comes to biological robots, which we're going to touch on soon. But on the other side, I mean, you've got someone like Mike, Mike Levin, for all those who know, but he's obviously within the panpsychist realm in that he sees this cognition happening in layers going upward, and then you are on the other end saying, actually, no, these are just phenomena occurring. But you're both producing such amazing work as a collaboration in a unit. How do you guys go about discussing these?
Surprisingly, it doesn't come up too much. I think we kind of nerd out on the nuts and bolts, you know, experimental side of it, and then how each of us interprets the implications of the work is sort of a private affair, I guess.
Okay, well, you guys have done something incredible, and I always think about it, and I always wonder why this isn't spoken about more. I mean, when you think of, firstly, what are biological robots, which we call now Xenobots, thanks to you guys. And I mean, these living machines that you helped design, they blur the line between life and machine. And how do they force us to rethink our definitions of life, intelligence, and even agency?
Sure. Yeah. So these biological robots, this was a collaboration, as you mentioned, between myself and Mike Levin at Tufts, and 2 of our collaborators, Sam Kriegman and Doug Blackiston. And so over 5 years ago now, the 4 of us were together on a funded project, and myself and Sam, as the roboticist, showed what we could do at the beginning of this collaboration, that we could teach an AI to reconfigure virtual robot parts, you know, in a supercomputer to make new virtual robots. And we demonstrated all of this. And then a week later, Mike and Doug joined us on the Zoom call. And Doug, who's a very talented microsurgeon, showed us that he built a version of one of our 4-legged robots under the microscope from frog cells. And I'll never forget this moment. There was complete silence on the call because this thing looked like, you know, our robots, traditional robots, but it was clearly something biological, and we found out it was made from frog cells. And so Sam and I immediately asked Doug, we said, can you take this statue and can we make it move? And it took Doug a few more months, but he figured out how to put some muscle cells in there. And then that was sort of the first Xenobot, this little 4-legged creature walking along the bottom of a petri dish. So the simplest explanation of a biological robot is it's a robot. It's something that's been built by us, in this case, us being an AI plus humans. It's been built by us to do something we want it to do, which in this first experiment was just walk along the bottom of a petri dish. A lot of folks don't realize it, but that's actually the original definition of a robot. It's something built by humans that runs around, is capable of moving about, and does stuff on our behalf. And in the original definition of robots, it comes from a Czech play over 100 years ago. And in that play, the robota were built from protoplasm. It was some sort of biological mass. But of course, then into the 20th century, along comes metal and plastics and ceramics and eventually electronics. And so now, and thanks to Hollywood, most people think of robots as things built from 20th century materials. But we're, in a way, as roboticists, this is very satisfying. We're going back to our roots, and we're tasking AI with building robots from living materials.
And I think there's, sorry, continue there.
No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think it would be more comforting to most people to see this type of architecture within a system that's robotic, in that it's not scary, it's not dangerously, it's not metal, it's not going to harm you or hurt you. It's softer, it's easier to look at. Do you think that psychologically this is an easy approach as well? Just for the
I think my experience has been the exact opposite of what you just described.
Okay.
People are absolutely terrified of what have been known as the Xenobots. We finished this work, we published it in a very visible journal, and it triggered this, huge media interest in, obviously, frog bots built by AI. What's not to love? So psychologically, it's kind of interesting, because I think the Xenobots have discovered one of the deepest parts of the uncanny valley. So for folks who haven't heard, the uncanny valley is something where there's something out there that's kind of like us, but also in an unexpected way not like us. And that seems to press on some very deep buttons in humans. So, all the zombie movies and TV shows that just never seem to end, zombies are a great example of something that's in this, uncanny valley. And I think ChatGPT and HAL from 2001, these disembodied authoritative voices from above, that somehow also presses our buttons. And now, maybe in retrospect, not so surprisingly, AI designed frog bots also frightens a lot of people. I will say that it's mostly older people, I think, that are afraid at the Xenobots. Mike and I now, on a daily basis, get emails from young folks saying, how do I train to become a Xenoboticist? And, they think it's the coolest thing under the sun. So it depends on who we're talking about.
How did the name Xenobot come about? Who said that the first time?
Yep. So that was Mike, and I'm probably going to botch this story, but I think he was sitting in on someone's PhD defense, and he saw a little bit of an animal cap. This is one part of a frog egg, and it was moving about on its own. And from Mike's perspective, it looked like a little robot running around doing something. And I think, if I'm getting the story right, that's where the name came from. But I think it fits quite well for this technology because it has the bot part in. These are living machines that have been built by us for a purpose. The Xeno comes from Xenopus laevis, which is the Latin name of the particular frog that we draw these cells from. But Xeno is also the Greek cognate for like stranger or newcomer, which was just coincidental, but it was a nice add to the term, I think.
Yeah, I think it's such a cool name. I think I might have asked Mike this many years ago, and I can't remember if the story matches me. I'll double.
Yes, you can compare.
Yeah,
see if I got it right.
But these Xenobots have demonstrated self-replication and something typically that's associated with life only. And what does this ability tell us about the relationship between reproduction, intelligence, and autonomy in living systems?
So this comes back to the top of our interview where you were asking me about intelligence and life. And to me, these things are entwined. So life is capable of perpetuating itself, making stuff, including parts of itself or copies of itself or offspring. And the ability to self-construct is a very good tool if your goal is to not get painted into a corner in the future, which for me is the working definition of intelligence. It gives you options. So one way of viewing the self-replicating xenobots is that in essence, we took individual frog skin cells and just like pulled them apart. So this is like a maximally deconstructed frog, incapable of its usual way of reproducing or perpetuating itself. And these skin cells seem like they want to come back together, and they sort of somehow figure out how to make copies of themselves. And I'm adopting the intentional stance here. I'm talking about frog cells wanting things and having goals. I'm not sure whether that's true, but again, it kind of makes sense. If you're an organism made up of a whole bunch of parts, a way to be intelligent is to make sure you can reconstitute yourself no matter what happens and continue on. So one of the interesting things about the self-replication study was, life finds a way. And this was certainly an unexpected way that had previously been unknown.
And I can sort of understand when you talk about the backlash, let's say, when you guys published the first batch of these papers, because when you think about the ethics within biology and with the way people perceived it years ago, anything relating to sort of tinkering with an animal, doing this or doing that with a cell, to them is sort of playing God, and it comes with a lot of backlash in general. I was watching one of your lectures, and I found it quite funny when you spoke about the tadpole that now has an eye on its butt. And I just thought to myself, yes. I mean, that's a joke. Today people watching it is something. We noticed that this thing was not harmed. It actually still evolved traits that could do things. The frog was fully functional, still able to turn around and then still catch its prey. So these systems adapted appropriately, and technically no harm was done. So do you think the ethics of just generally tinkering with biology is what's coming into play when it comes to this, rather than just being used to metal robots?
I think, obviously this is an old theme, possibly one of the oldest themes in humanity. Like what starts to happen when you tinker with things you're not supposed to tinker with, right? All major religions, their origin stories have to do with some version of that. And I would say this is just the latest chapter in that. And, that's where we as a global society are. We are now a technological civilization. We are doing things far beyond what our ancestors could do. And guess what? It's starting to cause some problems. So I can understand a lot of people's perspective here that we are tinkering with things that are very powerful, that can deflect in directions we didn't think of, and that can really cause problems for us. On the other hand, that is our reality. So the most dangerous thing we could do is just to stop innovating. If we're flying an airplane, if we turn off the engine, not a good solution. If we are going to, as a species or as part of this ecosystem, come back to a steady state, whatever that means, it's going to be by going forward and innovating rather than trying to turn things off and go back.
Do you think what a big fear would be is sort of creating new forms of life that could outpace or control us in a way that we did not anticipate?
I think so. So you mentioned outpace, right? So you look at, fear around AI technologies. Again, it boils down to the speed at which things are changing. And again, I think this is a reality that we are only now just waking up to. So 25 years ago, Bill Joy, the CEO of Sun Microsystems, an old type of computer, wrote a very influential article back then about exponential technologies. These are things that, grow at an exponential rate. And, we are now living in the exponential age. COVID is an example, computer viruses, the rapid improvement of AI and its exponentially growing powers. it's just where we are. So for me, the Xenobots are even more important because they are sometimes an exponential technology. They can grow exponentially if self-replication is involved. So we need to understand how exponential technologies work. It was a great human achievement that we developed the COVID vaccine. The Black Death lasted for centuries. COVID is still here, but the worst of it, was over in a few years. There will be things that spread exponentially around the planet, and we or AI have to learn how to create other exponential technologies that can bring the bad exponential technologies down as quickly as possible. And that requires understanding exponential technologies.
How was your experience with encountering these Xenobots when he showed you what he had done with your work? The first time you saw it, how did this fundamentally either change the way you saw the mind-body problem, or just impact you in general? How did it change your philosophical or psychological views on the concept of?
Yeah, sure. So it was a very visceral experience. So as a scientist, 99 things you try don't work. It's failure after failure after failure. And then every once in a while, if you're lucky, something like the Xenobots comes along. So I remember I was here in my office and my then PhD student, Sam, came in and showed me some preliminary data that the Xenobots that the AI had dreamed up in our supercomputer, Doug was able to build them under the microscope. So the AI in effect was right. It knew how to rearrange living materials to create a robot for us, and that robot did what it was supposed to do. And it was Thanksgiving time here, so there was no one in the research building here. And I remember just getting up and going for a walk in the hall, and my legs just felt like jello. Just realizing that the first realization was it's possible. You can do this. We can make machines from genetically unmodified living materials. This is not GMO. This is not something else. It's just possible. And for a scientist or an engineer, that's the best part. Just suddenly this whole new vista opens up. And then all the implications since then, are exciting and fun, but that was the big moment, for me at least.
Do you guys ever sit back and just reminisce on that day? Do you talk about the...
Not yet, but I'm hoping. We're so busy, because it really has started to snowball since then. And then typical nerds and scientists, we just get caught up in the work, and it's. I'm sure one of these days we'll sit back with a beer and say, well, remember when, but
yeah,
haven't quite found that moment yet.
Well, you've touched on this at the moment, AI's role in shaping biology, because this clearly showed us what could be possible. So it played a critical role in designing these Xenobots. Could you walk us through how AI is reshaping the way we design biological systems currently, and what this might mean for, let's say, future artificial in life or evolution in general?
Sure. So stepping back from the Xenobots for a moment, AI and biology in general, or biological engineering, genetic engineering, they're merging. So it's impossible to say. There's so many exciting things happening every week. So the first most obvious one is genetic engineering, that AI is being fed vast amounts of genetic information. And so AI is learning, if you tweak this gene, this will happen. If you tweak that gene, this will happen. And that's, immensely interesting and exciting. It's, bringing us a certain strains of rice that are very helpful in developing countries. It's lifting people out of poverty and misery, dealing with some huge health issues. Immensely powerful and helpful. Then there is the generative AI side, Gen AI, where it's not looking at data and learning how to tweak things, it's learning how to build things. And so at the moment, the big successes there have been at the subcellular level. So there are now AI designed proteins, and these proteins look and act like no other protein that humans have ever seen, right? And that's revolutionizing, drug design and, therapeutics in general. So the Xenobots then is sort of Gen AI at the supercellular level. So the AI is taking cells as the building block, not peptides, and putting those cells together to make things that are, a millimeter in size or a little bit larger to create little tiny machines. And so stepping back, we're basically developing AI that is learning how to tinker with life at all levels, subcellular, supercellular. I don't know how high up the scale we can go, but the trend suggests there doesn't seem to be a limit in sight yet.
Well, I'm not too familiar with the data within this field though, but when it comes to these proteins and these, does it ever give us insight into certain amino acids? Like maybe we missed something. Maybe there's something we haven't yet figured this out. Have there been cases like this where people are figuring things out where biologists just would have never considered or expected?
Absolutely. Now it's a much harder lift. It does happen. It's rarer because if you think about it, we've learned now that so AI is black box. It's able to do some amazing things and not bother to explain to us poor humans how it did it. But you can, make things harder on the AI by saying, please come up with new things we never thought of, and also come up with explanations that we as poor humans will understand. And that's a harder ask. We joke in the lab, from the AI's perspective, says, "Oh, you want me to also have to try and explain this to you? That's really hard." But it is possible, and I've dabbled with some of that in a different branch of AI, where the AI takes in raw data and spits out equations. It basically generates math to explain the data. And you can read this AI generated math term by term. And when this AI is working, it should generate the terms that you as an expert in that field are familiar with. You would expect to see this term, that term. Hey, wait a second, why? I don't recognize this term. That's where things get really interesting. So yeah, it does happen, but we are the weakest link in that chain, right? It's up to us to struggle to actually understand what the AI is trying to tell us.
It kind of reminds me of the film Her with Joaquin Phoenix, where at the very end, this artificial intelligence is just way too complex for him to even understand.
Yes, we're there already. Yeah. We're there already. It's, we're living in that reality for sure.
The outpacing is a problem, I would say, that a lot of us fear in general. Even I myself as a doctor, when I see how many of my colleagues use AI to draft motivation letters or even just to diagnose or try and interact with patients, they send an email reply. There's a lot of legalities around the privacy and obviously trying to not give out personal information, but people are using this everywhere all the time. It's almost inescapable, and we have to consider this to be part of the extended cognition we were talking about earlier. AI has now become fundamentally a part of this extended cognition. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the greatest extension of our abilities so far, right? And it's hard to argue that it isn't. It's it is definitely a sea change.
Yeah, I'm slowly struggling to see a day that goes by where I don't use some sort of artificial intelligence to assist.
And you probably used it 32 times today in ways you didn't even realize that you were using it, right? There's also that. There's the dark matter of AI that now exists in our world as well.
I can't remember who the author was who mentioned the technological singularity, but you think
Ray Kurzweil.
Yes. Do you think we're close to that? Do you think it's
I'm sounding like a cynic. I don't believe in the singularity. Things are moving fast and even possibly exponentially, but that doesn't mean that they will continue to. You see a lot of sigmoid curves in the world. Things suddenly get really, really fast, and then you start to get diminishing returns. I've never seen any phenomenon that just keeps going like this, and I don't see why AI would.
Well, let's bring it back. So this podcast obviously is focused on mind-body solution, the mind-body problem, consciousness, trying to understand this fundamental question. And I can't help but think, but I know you love sci-fi and growing up, this was something you were always fascinated by. Have you watched Ex Machina?
Ex Machina. Yes. I think I remember the
Garland. So Alex Garland. So the science advisor was Murray Shanahan, and he spoke about how when he was, one of the best scenes in the film was when Oscar Isaac asks sorry, the guy who asks Oscar Isaac about this artificial intelligence, he says, did it pass the Turing test? And he says, no, he doesn't need to. So she doesn't need to, because I want you to know this is a robot. I want you to know this is artificial intelligence. The question is, will you still believe its consciousness thereafter? So here the cards out on the table. We know this is not a conscious biological being. You know it's physically artificial intelligence, but are you still fooled? And he called us the Garland test since that film. Do you think that's it's more of an interesting approach, rather than having the normal Turing test, but rather know this is a non-biological being, but yet still be super convinced that it is conscious? And
I think I don't know that it helps much. I would mention Thomas Nagel's essay, what it is like to be a bat. So a bat is also not human. It is biological. But, humans have we've got a very long history of looking at things that are not us and making decisions. That's conscious. That's not conscious. That maybe is conscious. I'll never know whether that is conscious. So, in terms of, from that perspective, suddenly having, super realistic humanoids or, HAL level type chat GPTs, what's the difference? I don't know whether a bat is conscious. I also don't know whether ChatGPT is conscious. I don't know whether that's a well-formed question. I don't know that it's that different in that way.
Well, it's one of those things where the philosophical zombie will always come into play. There's absolutely no way for me to look at you and just assume that you are actually a conscious being. It is, I only have access to this mind, and all we do is taking cues and sort of make relative guesses as to what we think is conscious. Do you think we anthropomorphize things way too much as a species?
Way too much. Oh, that's a good one. We certainly do it, an obscene amount of time. I have a robot lawnmower at home, and my 4-year-old, he's basically views it as his sibling, and he will get upset with us if we work the lawnmower too much. It's everywhere. And robots are just going to exacerbate it. Now, whether it's too much, suggests that maybe it's a bad thing. Yeah. I think, the main thing that humans struggle with is increasing our circle of empathy. So if we mistakenly, empathize with things that maybe there's nothing at home, they're a zombie or not, I think better to err on that side than to err on the side of this is not something that's worthy of our consideration, our moral consideration.
When you look back at someone like Isaac Asimov, when he came up with his laws of robotics and AI, and then you look back to today with Xenobots present, how do you think that this field has fundamentally shifted and changed throughout its course?
Isaac Asimov, brilliant, creative, and also, like all of us, a creature of his time. So, it was a lot of, androids and that sort of thing, and metal and plastic. But with the laws of robotics, I think he got that exactly right, which is human hubris that we think we can put guardrails around complicated things. And so in AI and robotics, there's a famous term called perverse instantiation, which means that the machine somehow instantiates the behavior we want, but instantiates it in a perverse way. If you ask an autonomous vehicle to get the human occupant from point A to point B as quickly as possible, fastest way to do that is to drive in a straight line, through parks and over sidewalks, and it's everywhere, right? So, and it's a very difficult problem to solve. We end up having to tell all our AI technologies, please do X, but don't do it in this way, and don't do it in that way, and we keep tacking on these things, which reminds me of, all the things that went wrong with the 3 laws of robotics in Asimov's book. So I would say, actually, he was very prescient, and he got at the root of what the problem would be, which is exactly the problem we're all now wrestling with.
It's pretty incredible how these sci-fi writers back in the day just guessed so many things so accurately and well informed within their time. It's so cool to see it all come to fruition today. When you look at the field and the work you guys have done and that you've done over time, what do you feel most proud about? When you look back, what's the most exciting thing you think's been happening so far?
Oh gosh. That's very hard to say. A lot of the things we've done I found very personally satisfying in that for me they were good pieces of the puzzle in answering this question of how the body shapes the way we think. But some of those results are kind of, abstract or abstruse and they're going to have probably limited impact. So I guess I would say the Xenobots. For the simple fact that they've given society a new way to make helpful tools. If we want to clean up microplastics and not leave additional metal and stuff when we clean up, great. So I'm happy about that. And then there's also something about the Xenobots, as I mentioned, that seems inspirational to younger people, and that's something I care a lot about. I consider myself an old person. We've made a lot of problems that unfortunately younger folks are going to have to try and deal with somehow. And as a scientist and engineer, I feel morally responsible for trying to at least leave them some tools with which to try and solve some of these problems. And I hope that Xenobots will be one of those tools.
When you look back when you were growing up, who were the scientists or writers, sci-fi writers, whatever, that really inspired you and got you to like look at this field and think about it so seriously to a point where you guys create new organisms that have
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So there were no scientists in my family. It wasn't something that, was a part of my childhood. So I didn't actually really think about scientists or engineers or what we now called STEM. That wasn't a thing. Being a professor also wasn't, it wasn't really a thing in my family. But it was the sci-fi, and what I took away from it is all these things sound wonderful. Where are they? Like as a young person, I could see back then there are also problems. Like, wouldn't it be great? Like this literature seems to suggest there's other paths forward. There's other ways to do things, and then I would, from my limited vantage point, look around and I remember just being confused, like, why not? Why aren't we trying to? And then, of course, I learned as I got older that we were trying and failing miserably. I came of age in academia during the AI winter when nothing was working. It seemed that, robots and AI was 1,000 years off. And for me, I guess my personality, the challenge appealed to me. The fact that there were so many failures that even if I entered the field and was slightly less of a failure, that would be progress. That, being able to contribute a small bit. And then suddenly the AI summer happened and, all these other things started to happen. But anyways, that's how I got to this point.
You mentioned something like STEM, being a professor. When you think about your work and how it bridges biology, computer science, robotics, philosophy, so many different fields, this interdisciplinary work that you guys are doing, so many different people coming together. How do you think that this has changed the game for you guys? Because it wasn't a thing back in the day where, we're all stuck in these niche fields and everybody's just doing their own work. Even within biology, you'll have a biologist who knows nothing about a specific molecule. And there's so little that everyone knows about everyone else's work. But I see you guys doing this in such an interdisciplinary way that it's pretty epic to watch from the outside. And how's that been for you?
Well, first of all, it's been very difficult and it's been very slow going. So we've been talking about the Xenobots, which is kind of the end, or it's a stopping point on a very long journey. I was very fortunate, and again, just by chance, to have fallen into various programs at different universities in 4 different countries that taught me how to be an interdisciplinary researcher. There are ways, to do it very badly, right? So, jack of all trades, master of none. It's not an easy thing to do. The reason that most people are specialists, and I'm glad there are specialists, is because it's easier to drill down and really grasp a branch of human knowledge and extend it than it is to try and connect 2 branches together. It takes at least twice as long. So in the case of my collaboration with Mike, I told you about, the Xenosculpture and then the Xenobot, but, it took a long time to get to that point. We don't even speak the same languages. You have to learn what each are capable of, what takes a week, what takes 5 years, all those sorts of things. And then, then you can proceed carefully. And of course, in some cases, all of this effort is worth it because you get lucky with something like the Xenobots. But it is definitely not the norm.
Yeah, and then you get stuck on a podcast that's philosophical based on the mind-body problem being asked, what is consciousness?
That's right. That's right. You got to roll with the punches.
Tell me, Josh, when you think about this field moving forward, what excites you most about it? What do you think in terms of the future of the industry, people that are working perhaps under you or work that you've seen? What's been most exciting, and even within your own work?
Yeah. So I am interested in the philosophical side of things. So one of the things that I see in the Xenobots and some of the other kind of exotic robots that we work with is a conflation of thought and action. So if you take a Roomba, the robot vacuum cleaner, you can point to the wheels and you can say action. You can open it up and point to the CPU and say, thought or cognition or processing. Traditional robots, there is a Cartesian cut you can make that separates the body from the brain. But what I'm excited about is if you look at a lot of cutting edge technologies, that separation is becoming less and less obvious, which I think is, finally the beginnings of an acid that's dissolving this distinction that, at least in the West, has been around for over 300 years. And so I think that's great from a purely intellectual point of view. But again, it also is important for us as a species to understand that, brains are not everything and everything else is expendable. The story is much more complicated than that. And I think that's finally overturning Cartesian dualism will actually be a positive thing for society, assuming it actually happens.
Yeah, no, Keith Frankish, the one who coined the term illusionism, he's writing a book called Escaping Descartes' Prison. And it's fundamentally premised on that whole idea that this Cartesian dualism is definitely on a decline. However,
I know Keith, and I'm glad to know he's also like wielding an axe from a different direction. Well, we're doing our empiricist best, and hopefully the tree will come down.
But on the flip side, if you think about it, Josh, while that Cartesian dualism is breaking down, you've got a rise in panpsychism and idealism as well. So you've got a whole group of thinkers that think that either everything is conscious or everything is consciousness. What are your thoughts on that? I know this is not your field. Now we're just going beyond.
You know what? I'm okay with it. I'm okay with that. It's actually the stance in the middle that I find problematic. I am conscious and that thing over there isn't, so it doesn't matter what I do to it. Like, that's the problem. So if there are a greater number of folks that believe everything is conscious and we should be careful about how we interact with other things and other entities, great. If the illusionists say, listen, we're all on the same level playing field, for different reasons, that's also good. I think my problem is actually the intermediate stance.
Yeah, I agree. I think ethically and sort of the moral philosophy behind both of those, whether it's illusionism or panpsychism, pretty much lead to the same thing, in that we're all the same thing.
We're all the same thing, exactly.
And I think that's pretty much what all aligns. And even within an idealist philosophy where they think that everything is consciousness and we're just a part of it, that also tends to always lead to some sort of this consciousness trying to love itself, enjoy itself. It always leads in some sort of an empathetic, positive worldview, which I think in essence would be a better option anyway, instead of drawing these fundamental lines between one thing or another. But when you think about your work currently, what are you guys doing that you think we should be looking forward to the most and that you're most excited about?
Yeah, so this is true of the Xenobots in general, but we are also doing a lot of work in my lab with what are called meta materials. And these are human engineered materials that act very differently from natural materials. And it turns out that these meta materials also are capable of thought or cognition and action simultaneously. Imagine that I take a sheet of this material and I start vibrating it. but I vibrated at different frequencies. It turns out you can get this material to do different things at these different frequencies and actually use these different frequencies to carry information. You can design a sheet of this material that when you shake it, it performs logical AND at one frequency and logical OR at the other frequency simultaneously. And while computing that function, the material is moving, and if you put it on the ground, it will actually move along the ground. So where is the distinction between thought and action? So in answer to your question, I'm excited about, all of these exotic materials, which includes living materials that conflate thought and action, and then AI's ability to exploit the potential of these new materials to make useful machines in ways, Hollywood hasn't even begun to explore. They will, I guess, but not yet.
They always eventually catch up, but that's incredible. I mean, there's so much groundbreaking stuff occurring that, I mean, you're right. The pace, even for me, when I watch what you guys do, sometimes when I look at it, I think like this is crazy how fast this is happening. Like you see 5 years ago, one Xenobot's made, and now suddenly you guys are making materials that can vibrate at different frequencies.
I mean, the reason I would say is, again, Mike and myself and some others, have been on a very long journey to try and see things differently, to escape from the Cartesian worldview, right? So if you don't escape, you do things like ChatGPT and you try and make bigger and bigger brains, which I would say is also useful. Nothing against, OpenAI and ChatGPT and Stable Diffusion. They're great. But the reason I think that we are discovering a lot of things is because we're not looking under the lamppost anymore, right? We're out in the dark, and it turns out there's a lot of stuff out there. It's just that people haven't thought to look there, been able to get there because you have to think in a non-Cartesian way to get there. You have to ignore a distinction between body and brain, and then you start finding these weird materials and finding ways to bend them to new purposes.
Something I found particularly fascinating when I listened to you speak was you mentioned something about cause and effect, and until an artificial intelligence is able to actually cause an effect, that's when you know that this thing has become fundamentally part of reality. Do you want to expand on that idea?
Sure. So this is something that current AI technologies struggle with, cause and effect. The best a non-embodied AI can do is sort of read about all cause-effect relationships that humans have written about on the internet or in books or whatever. That's all those AIs have access to. And they can do okay with cause and effect. Not great, but again, how the body shapes the way we think. Like I said, I have a 4-year-old at home and he pushes a coffee mug off the table and it shatters. Like he caused an effect. And not only did it shatter, but he sees how his two parents react and how they react differently to when you can push against the world literally, there is a massive amount of rich, effectual data that comes back. And so I say this a lot. Embodied cognition is about pushing against the world and observing how the world pushes back. And that is a cause-effect loop. You can cause them in all sorts of ways, from pushing a coffee cup off a table to changing a society, landing someone on the moon, all sorts of things, and that gives embodied learners, not just human learners but non-human learners, a front row seat for cause and effect. If you're not sure, if you're thinking that this effect is caused by that cause, just go out and verify it. Be a scientist. Push against the world and see whether you were right or not. It's actually very simple when you think about it. So I think there are some of these examples that make clear why we can't just ignore the body. It matters in very important ways.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think it was a paper I read. I can't remember the author's name, but I'll try and find it. But it's called the nobody problem. Just that there's a problem in having nobody. That's the thing. It's a fundamental.
That's the real problem. Agreed.
Nobody problem is a big problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it goes down to the crux of what we're talking about. But that same cause and effect that you're talking about is that almost, it reminds me of that inactivist part. The fact that we're here trying to consistently and continuously do something. Like there's a purpose driven behind everything we do. We must find food. We see it. We see something red. We know it might be an apple. There's this interaction with reality that's always looping back and forth. And do you think
Absolutely.
that fundamentally with AI, we would either have to program it to have some sort of a personal loss of, if it does not exist, we must have some sort of program within it, or does it not need something like that in order to be?
Yep. I think it absolutely needs it, but not necessarily in the literal sense of, making robots that push against the world and observing how the world pushes back. All the, Chat GPT and all the chatbots, they kind of already are doing it because they say stuff and that affects their human interlocutors, some of whom go off and do things and then report back to Chat GPT, which becomes part of its training set. So, modern AI, they already have slaves, which is us. They can use us to try out cause and effect relationships. I don't know, what the big AI companies are doing. A lot of them are very smart. They probably started to figure this out. So, there are ways that you can learn about the real world. You can learn about cause and effect where you have something or someone else go and, embody that cause and effect loop for you. So it's already happening.
That's a crazy thought. In other words, we are AI's extended mind.
We absolutely are. So it is an extended mind already. It's got, I don't know how many of us as its end effectors. It's happening.
Crazy. Do you think that a bigger step would to take this even further would be then giving it this sort of sense of loss? So having such a hardwired program that if it ceases to exist, that's a fundamental problem. The same way we are so afraid of death. Do you think that's a big factor that we'll have to consider in the future to make this more human?
It's a really good question. I don't know whether like a fear of death or extinction is a necessary component for developing embodied cognition. If it is, that's going to be problematic because this is something Hollywood has explored in great detail. If you give technologies existential dread, they'll do everything they can in their power to avoid it. And I agree with it. That just makes sense. So I think actually it's a research question. Like we started talking about self-awareness and how that might have evolved in us to avoid extinction, avoid death. But it's not necessarily true that technologies can't become self-aware and practice cause and effect internally and verify it physically, that all needs to be driven by, fear of extinction. I hope it's not true. I hope that, they don't have to rely on that for their motivation, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, a lot's going to probably change in the next few years. And I think as we said, it's very fast paced, not to the point of a singularity, but very fast in general. When you look back at your views on consciousness and the mind, how often have you changed your views regarding consciousness and the mind-body problem? So when you were young, let's say, prior to entering the field as a student, perhaps, what did you have a Cartesian mindset on this? Did you think there was a sort of soul or
I did not have a religious I did not have a religious upbringing, but I was convinced there was someone in there. And that's just because I was raised in the West. Pretty much everyone, even if you're an atheist, that's what you're taught indirectly and directly. So. So my awakening was at the University of Sussex. I did my master's there, and Margaret Bowden and Phil Husbands and Inman Harvey and Anil Seth, they did a very good job of disabusing us of that notion, or at least, presenting it that it's just one view. And so that was the start for me. And then, then developing self-aware robots and actually kind of how easy it was to do that. Well, it wasn't super easy, but surprisingly easy. That was the final nail in the coffin for me. I was like, if we can make this $29 robot, be able to create an awareness of self, it's not really something special. It's probably, it's not, we should take it off the pedestal. Let's put it that way.
Do you think there'll be a fundamental shift or difference when you're able to give these self-aware agents agency or allow it to make choices and then interact with those cause and effects? at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the things I love about AI and robots is like how creative they are. So, there's all these hilarious AI fails, but they're also, some of them are really creative. So it'd be great if they're also creative wins. Like again, when the AI says, I'm going to make a protein like this, and all the human experts on the planet say, you can't make a protein like that. And then, of course, it does. Like that's it. So, humans can only push against the world in so many ways. And wouldn't it be great if we had allies, here in the real world that could push on the world in ways that we just can't? And they're going to learn cause and effect relationships that would have been impossible or would have taken us a very, very long time to discover. That's the future that I'm excited about.
Yeah, no, I think it's incredible work. You guys are really changing the game, and there's so many different aspects to the work that we haven't really even touched on because there's so much greater detail that we could go into. But is there anything particular that you'd like to touch on that you feel like you haven't mentioned about your work in general, Josh? Because this is obviously just the first podcast we've had together, but there's certain papers we could dissect in so much detail. But before we ever do, is there anything particular you'd like to mention?
Well, one thing I think we mentioned in passing but didn't have a chance to address is how the work on Xenobots and even AI designed biology is changing like our understanding of life itself.
Yes.
Most of us were taught that frog DNA codes for frogs and human DNA codes for humans. And what I've learned in working with Mike and also just looking at the intersection between AI and biology in general is that the species and organisms that exist on the planet, they're points in an attractor space. So this sort of means that when you're in familiar environments, your genes tend to build humans or frogs or what have you, but that you can change the environment in quite drastic ways, including the embryo itself, or even take it apart into its component cells and put them together in new ways. And without changing any of the genetics, you get new form and function. So there's an old idea in biology of what's called morphospace. And it's this imaginary high dimensional space of every possible living thing that could survive on this planet. And despite how creative Mother Nature's been over the last 3.5 billion years, she's only explored a vanishingly small part of morphospace. So, the obvious question is what else is out there? Everyone, is curious about aliens, and maybe we'll find some on another planet someday, but we can kind of find them like now, here, by asking an AI to say, here's frog, here's human, here's axolotl. Now go in the opposite direction. Put them at your back and drive into morphospace as far from familiar organisms as you can to find those that can exist here. And then build them for us, please. The prospect of that, is going to revolutionize biology, beyond recognition, I think.
I had one of those questions down to further elaborate on that. Remember when I told you about the extra questions I had planned for us?
Yes.
It brings me back to one of the other questions. I wrote, you've used evolutionary algorithms to evolve solutions to both software and hardware. How do these algorithms reflect or perhaps extend the principles of natural selection?
Oh, yeah. Gosh. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a biologist, so I'm sort of speaking beyond my professional expertise here. I don't know that it really is beyond natural evolution. I mean, we're just, AI is a product of us and we're a product of natural evolution, and the AI is modifying or putting pressures on these organisms in ways they haven't experienced before. So, from a bit of a distance, and if you squint, it is just, natural selection has just entered a new chapter, like when, the fish crawled out of the seas or we came down from the trees. It just feels like a different phase in a similar process. I don't know if we've broken out of the bounds of natural selection yet. It is unnatural, of course, because there's things like AI and robots and supercomputers involved, but ultimately it's just challenging genetically unmodified materials to survive and continue. And they're finding a way to do so.
I agree with you. I think I had this conversation with, someone recently where we spoke about the fact that it took us billions of years to get here to have this sort of experience. It doesn't mean that if we're able to do it within 5 minutes in a lab, that this is some sort of a miracle, or it's just literally all that work that's taken place. As you know, with the cells that you take, it's already got so much prior information, and it's just always working on itself. So it's not like we're going beyond the bounds of nature itself.
Yeah. And I think, the other thing is we talked about the Cartesian dualism. A lot of this work, not just ours, but others as well, is exploding the concept of self. We tend to view things about like at the self level. If you think about the Xenobots and the cells that make up the Xenobots, from the cell's perspective, things might not actually be that different, or problematic. When a frog develops or any organism develops, the cells that are part of the developmental process, they're being pulled and pushed and sheared and shoved through tubes like crazy all the time. So all of our manipulations from the perspective of the cell might just be business as usual. It's find your neighbors and connect to them and establish calcium communication again, and so I agree, like the Xenobots in some ways seems miraculous if you think about it from the frog's perspective, but if you think about it from the frog's cell's perspective, maybe it's not so, surprising or traumatic.
And I think that's where I think Mike at some point, and that's when they see cognition going all the way down, is that it's really, really hard to actually differentiate this type of process in terms of cognition. When you look at a Xenobot and you see it exhibiting some sort of autonomous behavior, have you ever found yourself ascribing some sort of agency or free will to this to this being?
I can feel the temptation to want to do so. Let's put it that way. Again, I'm an illusionist. I know I'm being fooled. I can feel it. And yes, sometimes it takes more effort than other times to resist.
Have you always, at what point have you actually said firmly, I'm an illusionist? Was this something you one day read, or was
I think I was, and then I met Keith and Dan at a workshop a while back and learned this actual term. I said, that's it. That's what I am. I think I felt it before I knew what it was.
I think that's exactly the way I felt about it. And then one day watching Dan and then Keith eventually as well, because he helped me with my dissertation, which was quite cool.
Oh, okay.
Nicholas Humphrey also gave some input, and Mark Solms,
great.
Which is pretty cool. And I actually have a chat coming up with Mark and Carl Friston. They're going to have a nice chat together about some of the work you guys do as well. But
that's great.
Then after this podcast, it's weird how my firm illusionist beliefs have slowly become slightly less intense. And I find I don't see myself changing it anyway, but I'm far less firm about the belief than I used to be. But I remember when I wrote the dissertation, very, very firm illusionism, and to the point. And it's just, to me, it just made the most sense that we're just playing mind games with ourselves all the time. It's a very difficult thing to understand.
True. Agreed.
It's a strange phenomenon. In terms of your work, everything you've done, how has this overall impacted your entire view of this field of understanding the mind-body connection?
I think what it's convinced me of is that whatever the answer is, and I don't think we have it yet, it's going to be very confusing, very non-intuitive. This is what I've learned as a student of AI and robots, is that things that work, for Mother Nature, they're very, very confusing, non-intuitive. So I think there are some answers to, some of our deeper questions as society, who we are, what makes us special, if anything, how the body shapes the way we think, what are aliens going to look like and how are they going to behave? Whatever the answer is, it's not, what I've learned from the Xenobots and these metamaterials, they act in these very, very strange, surprising ways. And I think we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg. The fact that huge matrix multiplications can give rise to things that look like, brilliant human conversation. Like things are moving quickly, and everything that happens is surprising to the public in general and also to the experts. And to me, that's changing my worldview to be like, whatever we thought the answer was, it's much, much stranger. It kind of feels like the quantum revolution for like everything other than physics is now
Yeah.
happening. Physics already had its, brush with the ineffable and
Yeah.
unexplainable.
And,
Now it's our turn.
and within, I mean, quantum computers, quantum biology, these are on the rise. This is a thing that's happening. A lot
Also,
of people are taking this very seriously. But these
right.
metamaterials are really intriguing to me. And where do you think this is going to lead?
Oh, I think, the metamaterials are the future. Like, all the materials that we build with, they have problems. You can only build a building so high because the weight ratio, so metamaterials are amazing. Like I see a future in which, we can cut a robot in half and the two halves will form two smaller versions of exactly the same robot. Living materials like cells, when they attach to rigid materials, those cells become more rigid. When they attach to soft materials, they become softer. Cells are like chameleons. And so I think we're going to make metamaterials that are the same way, that they get the hint. When you try and use them to be something, they become that thing. They construct what they need, or they change. That's what 21st century technologies are going to look like as we push further into the 21st century.
I think this is probably one of the most exciting or sci-fi-ish thing I've heard in quite some time. Like
And again, we were talking about surprise. The surprising thing is a lot of those materials already exist. They're just kind of in labs at the moment. They're not in general use, but the aerospace companies, they have R&D labs around these things. And so these materials, ironically, these materials are being designed by AI. And then once they're designed by the AI can figure out how to exploit them. How can they best be incorporated into buildings and roads and cars and plumbing and you name it. It's amazing. It hasn't quite reached the public, eye yet, but it's coming.
It's kind of crazy because it's almost like, I mean, we're making biological robots, and then at the same time, you are, but then at the same time, you're making now materials more biological. It's kind of like you're doing you're doing like the flip side on both sides. It's just pretty crazy and cool.
And again, not just my lab, some of the exciting things that are going on in these interdisciplinary labs are exactly that, like blurring the line between living and non-living materials, right? So again, there's another distinction that we just assume is so obvious and so clear cut. And from the AI's perspective, it says, why? I don't understand. I'll embed some proteins in a plastic to make, a protein infused plastic. So what is that now? Is that a living thing, a non-living thing? I don't know.
Yeah, just like make the metal some sort of an ion channel to assist with like shifting cells. I mean, it's
Exactly.
crazy that when you think about what the potential this has and how much this can affect medicine and every other field, it's so widespread that it would literally change humanity. Like it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
This is sci-fi at its max.
Well, you don't need, I don't think we need the singularity. There'll be sufficiently crazy stuff that will happen without us all uploading to the cloud or
no, this
whatever
is probably the most exciting thing I've heard. Like, and trust me, when you scroll online and you doom scroll, you see a lot of crazy things. But this is pretty cool. I mean, I can't wait to see what you guys come up with, and I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, it's incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, no. So, Josh, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. Any final words from your side? Anything you'd like to add?
Well, just as we're wrapping up, you were asking me about some other things that we might not have talked about. Just one last thing I wanted to mention about connecting AI and embodied cognition is where we are at the moment. So we now have these immensely, powerful AIs that say compelling things, but instinctually we're not sure whether to trust what they say. So we're doing some work here in the lab, and there are others that are doing so as well, which is, combining non-embodied technologies like ChatGPT with embodied technologies like robots. And so what we see on the horizon is a human has a problem. They come to an AI, they ask for a solution, and the AI proposes something that sounds great. And the human says, I don't know that I trust you, prove it. And the AI says, connect me to a 3D printer, prints a robot that goes out and, physically verifies, does some experiments, to show some version of this solution or some aspect of it. So can we teach AI to design experiments that will prove whatever it is that it's proposing? So I think that's something else we haven't talked about. That's often known as like AI science or AI-driven science or machine science. That also, I think, has huge potential for dealing with, at the moment, what seems like an intractable problem, that there's no way to guarantee what a chat GPT says. And I agree. It doesn't matter what it or anyone says. The proof is in the physical world. Yes. And I think we're going to start to see some of that emerging in the not too distant future.
And so far, Josh, have you seen anything remotely close to that, or how far off are we?
We're close for toy problems. I guess I would say in terms of like practical utility, we're still a ways off. I don't even know that we're ready morally or ethically to allow an AI to build things to prove its ideas about the world. There's another one for Hollywood to play with, but
that actually is quite a good script for a film. That is.
Yeah, exactly. No lack of raw material here. But anyways, I just wanted, I guess I wanted to close by saying, I don't think, it's non-embodiment against embodiment, that some of the really valuable technologies and solutions in the years to come are going to be, clever ways of combining them so you get the best of both worlds.
And in general, I mean, life and not life, that dichotomy, that false dichotomy, it seems that at some point we're all going to be chemically bonded in some way.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think that's a beautiful way to probably end it, Josh. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Wonderful work.
No, thank you, Tevin. It was a pleasure to be on your show.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to hopefully have a round two and further dissect maybe specific papers, and we can go have some deep dives in the future. It's a privilege to chat to you, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. And again, thanks for your interest. And you clearly put a lot of time and effort into preparing. This was a real pleasure.